As I in Eden first awake, my eyes at once perceive the goodness and the beauty of creation and receive by it knowledge of the one who made it and believe. In beauty there is truth. As I in Eden wake again, beside me woman stirs, the beauty of creation both surpassed and summed in hers. I praise God for the knowledge of himself which such confers. In beauty there is truth. As I in Eden wake once last, eternal by Christ's grace, in beatific vision meet my Maker face to face, and see the source from which on earth all things their beauty trace. In beauty there is truth. I know this to be sooth. In beauty there is truth. Welcome everyone to Ratio in Review for the week of October 6th, 2014. As always, you can reach us at ratioatrutgers at gmail.com, or you can go to our Facebook group, Ratio at Rutgers, or our YouTube page, also Ratio at Rutgers. We're very easy to find. I am your host, neither called nor ordained, the unrevered, irreverent Reverend Matthew J. Therio. My co-host this week, two new ones, undoubtedly the universe's numero uno unicyclist, Stephen Toledo, and a one-woman Woodward and Bernstein, the Lois Lane-like Andrea Morocoima. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
Excellent. Okay, and as always, we introduce ourselves to our listeners, since we have rotating guests. They don't always get to know us. Instead of going into our faith backgrounds this week, I wanted to go into our background in the fine arts and our appreciation, because that's what we're talking about. This week's episode is all about aesthetics. So I'll start off. Some of my favorites are absolutely the Baroque period, and that's kind of been of late. I've been visiting a lot of art museums lately, the MoMA, the Met, so many times, the Philadelphia Art Museum. Among my favorites, Caravaggio, Peter Paul Rubens, Rembrandt, the greats. Getting into more modern contemporary, Salvador Dali, especially his Hyper Crucifixus. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. It's Jesus on a cross, but it's, like a tesseract almost. Norman Rockwell, I think I just said. And really, I find a lot of meaning, or if not meaning, a great deal of appreciation in modern commercial artists. Ralph McQuarrie, Drew Struzan, Frank Franzetta, Boris Vallejo, Alex Ross, my absolute favorite. So let's... and as far as my own history goes, I've never really formally studied aesthetics. I should have in undergrad. I didn't even realize that was an option to fulfill my art credit. I had a terrible advisor. Genius of a guy. Like, he shouldn't have been a faculty advisor. Like, he should have been translating more of the Dead Sea Scrolls with that time. But, so I didn't know I could take aesthetics, but it's something I personally studied for over a year, just in deep contemplation after grad school. So it's always been one of my favorite topics. After Time and Eternity, it's probably my favorite topic in all of philosophy. So I'm so excited about this week.
Awesome.
Okay, so that's where I'm coming from. Steven?
Okay, so I studied art in undergrad, and I've been painting since high school, so it's been about 10 years now since I first started doing oil painting. And I've been heavily influenced by Caravaggio, Cezanne, and actually a lot of the Impressionists. But particularly, I like to look at light and shadow and really look into kind of the everyday beauty of just reflections and contemplating how everything comes together. I also studied physics undergrad, and it kind of ties in there that everyday objects have an infinite mystery that we haven't fully explored yet.
Andrea, why don't you tell us about your history with aesthetics and art and all of that?
I also really like that contrast of light and dark. I love to study light in art. I didn't start with color until a couple years into my art quote-unquote career, which isn't very long. But Caravaggio is one of my favorites as well. I was never formally trained as an artist and never went to art school, but I did take one art class in college, and I do a lot of oil paintings, acrylics, charcoal, pencil sketching, and I'm very much drawn to folk art. Manuel Blanes is one of my favorite artists. He's an Uruguayan artist, and he does a lot of the cowboy culture in his paintings, and that very much appeals to me. But yeah, I'd love to launch into our discussion about beauty.
Well, excellent. So let's get into the actual meat in the matter this week. We're going to deal with two main questions. One, the question of what is beauty, and then we're going to tackle what is art. So in answering what is beauty, we're going to offer a few possible definitions, because very few words have only one possible definition, And let's start with the historical, just because that's more or less the simplest. And if you're going to start with the historical definition of beauty, you have to go back to Platonism. And the whole trinity, the Platonic trinity of truth, goodness, beauty, kalan, truth, agathon, goodness, aletheis, that's not exactly ever in Plato himself, but in a lot of the later Platonists and Neoplatonists, you eventually do get that very specific ordering. And I remember my undergrad, in one of the faculty wings, had those three words, etched upon the arches. That's how highly these things, these transcendentals, are regarded. So these things are considered the form of the good, the very first emanations of the monad, which is pure being. Sometimes, it'll be called God in Platonism. Whether a Platonist calls that God or not, it depends on how influenced they are by Plotinus. And these are the only things that are absolute and objective ends in and of themselves. So they're as close to pure being as you can get. They're the most true things in the world, more real than us. In Platonism, this is how truth, goodness, and beauty have been historically regarded. So that's an easy definition there. To get into the metaphysical definition that you guys see that I wrote, I actually have to explain my metaphysics a little bit. Like, for me, the question of what is beauty ties into the whole question of what is reality. And I have a three-tiered structure of reality. The middle tier is our physical world right here. And let's take this table that we're sitting around. There's no table. There's just a collection of atoms, matter, energy, space-time, the quantum vacuum. That's the only, there. Yeah, that's the only reality. The table only exists at a sub-level of reality, this third level, which I call the semantic level. This is a table because we call it a table. Right. There's nothing intrinsic about it. There's no Platonic form of the table which this inheres. I do think that there is a metaphysical reality, though. And that is getting into things that are necessary truths. So I have something of a similar conception to Plotinus as for what God is. Divine simplicity. Simplicity, I think, is the most fundamental attribute of God. He's almost, a way to describe it would be not a proposition, a principle describing nothing in and of itself, but existing in eternal relation to creation, to this physical material reality.
So he exists outside of reality, but
he's transcendental to it, but in an eternal relationship. And so, insofar as reality has multiplicity, that relation is the very definition of mathematics.
Right.
Math is metaphysically real because it's this relationship between God and the multiplicity of creation. Geometry is objectively real because there's spatial relations in creation. Morality, objectively real because there is this relationship between God and independent free agents in creation. So for me, beauty is one of these things.
But even if you say for me, you're making it subjective. You would have to say in reality.
According to my definition.
Yeah.
According to my metaphysics, this is where beauty fits in.
Right.
It is the objective principle deriving from the necessary relationship between divine simplicity and sensory perception, with specific regards to things like proportion, balance, harmony, contrast. What were a few of the other things that he was saying last week?
Symmetry is huge.
Symmetry, yep. I couldn't remember all of them.
Yeah, symmetry speaks of order. There has to be some kind of arrangement in order for two things to be so symmetrical in a very complex way. And that's why the human body is symmetrical, because there is an order and a structure to it that is designed. So we do see symmetry as relating to beauty. And I definitely ascribe to your, did you call it the Platonic view?
Historically or metaphysically,
Towards beauty.
Yeah. Okay. We'll call it the Platonic view.
The Platonic view. Okay.
This metaphysics is three-tiered metaphysics of reality. I call Therian.
Therian. So you adopted your own philosophy. Awesome. I definitely ascribe to that, and I think I'm a very visual person. I think artists like Steven and I are very visual, right?
This is why I doodle during the meetings.
Exactly.
I process better that way.
Through images, and I do as well. I see it almost cut in two different fields. We have the physical and the metaphysical, and you draw a line through both. And then in the metaphysical, we have these values, which are beauty, truth, and goodness. And those are all shadows of who God is, right? And so how do we relate to those? If we are physical creatures with bodies living in a physical world, how do we access that metaphysical part of life? And so I see our experience as something that straddles a line of the physical and metaphysical, but also brings us to these values of beauty, truth, and goodness. And how does it do that? Well, we have neurons, right? We have eyes, we have ears, and we have all these sensory mechanisms that can understand the physical world around us. Those are physical. We can agree on that. We can sit on a table and study our brains firing as we look at different things. But there's also a metaphysical aspect that is interwoven in our physical experiences. So we take belief. Belief takes listening. It takes perceiving. It takes brain work. But in belief, we access metaphysical ideas. We cannot weigh 2 + 2 = 4. We can try and understand it, but we can't actually weigh that idea. And so belief is the experience that brings us from the physical to the metaphysical of truth. Appreciation is what brings us from the physical of aesthetics to the metaphysical of beauty. Action to do goodwill is what takes us from the physical of rules and all that. Well, rules is kind of metaphysical, isn't it? So that doesn't really work. I think my framework falls apart there.
Huh.
So we'll stick with truth and beauty.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that for goodness.
But you have a series of 3 articles that you wrote recently entitled "Can We Kill Beauty?" that discuss just this. And you were saying at the very beginning that you're a very visual person, and I know that you created graphs and charts, and I broke down what you're saying and created a visualization of exactly that.
Yes.
So would you like to direct our listeners to those articles?
Yes, of course. That's at ratiochristi.org/Rutgers. And there you'll see all of my blog posts on Can We Kill Beauty? And we're investigating if beauty is something that's solely physical, we should be able to kill it, or in some way decompose it, or destroy it in a way, as we can destroy physical things. But we see beauty transcending the decomposition of objects. Even if a mother dies, even if things decay, if buildings are destroyed, beauty continues through all generations. So how is it that this endures? Is it metaphysical? Is it eternal?
Now, is it only the 3 articles, or do you have more coming out on the subject?
I might having a 4th coming out, but
excellent. We'll
I
look
can't
forward
make
to
any
that.
promises. Yeah,
Okay.
I'd like to.
I'd like to offer one final definition of beauty. Oh, do you have more to say on
I
this?
wanted to actually ask Steven, because he had some really good feedback on that about the constancy and eternal aspect of beauty. He had some great feedback, and I wanted to kind of bounce back and forth.
So, I don't have a specific definition of beauty. However, I find it odd to say that just because something is, eternal, or like even indestructible, like a concept, like I could form any idea. Like I don't know that, just because it doesn't physically exist, nor that like it continues after the person who had the idea gone away, that means that it's a divine concept, like that it exists in this metaphysical that it exists as a metaphysical connection to the divine, and is really more just like a metaphysical idea, and by that I just mean like it's it's an emergent phenomena, or
Right.
I guess
So-
it's semantic. In
So
the way
exactly,
that,
according to my 3 level, you would say it's sub-real, sub-physical, not transcendent.
Yes, yeah.
So you're coming from the naturalist point of view, where you don't necessarily believe in the existence of a god, so beauty cannot be metaphysical.
Not in this framework. I could also use metaphysical for semantic things, just taking it to mean outside of physics. But if
Using the term metaphysics to mean something transcendental to the physical realm, something above it, something more real than the physical,
that I wouldn't
then you
do.
couldn't. Yeah.
So I'm not actually sure what you mean by what you meant by killing beauty, because it's an idea, and it wasn't alive to begin with. It and any idea once conceived, I'd say is will last as long as people are aware of it.
Fascinating. So 2 things in response to that. I think you hit a great point, which is how can we kill beauty if it was never alive to begin with? And I think that's precisely what I was trying to reach, that beauty is not living, because something that is eternal doesn't have to be constrained by a time, so the time spectrum. It's constantly existing. So because beauty is eternal, it cannot begin and it cannot end. It cannot be killed. It cannot be destroyed. And so in that sense, I'm saying, yes, I agree with you. It is an idea. It cannot be simply physical. It's something that transcends the physical. And I forgot my second point.
But as far as I'm concerned, it's it's the same as a semantic idea as table. As long as we are sitting at something, as long as people are aware of things to be sat at, tables will go on.
You're right. Do you believe that if a group of people stops believing an idea, that idea no longer exists?
It depends on how I want to interpret the term exist. If I were to take let's say a 4-dimensional view of time, where
The B-theory eternalist view.
Yes, I think we've gone over that. But basically, rather than thinking about discrete moments, if it has existed at all for any duration of time, that existence can be traced through the timeline, and even if it ceases, it still exists in the past.
Right. All events, past, present, and future, have the same ontological status.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, yeah. Do we want to move on to the next definition of beauty?
Yeah.
Okay, let's explore this one a little bit. This I call the teleological. And basically it's saying that sensory experience of intrinsic aesthetic value has a natural end in the contemplation of the beatific vision of the divine. And of course, this is again presuming the existence of the divine. But it's saying that beauty exists to draw us nearer to God. And this seems to be what Dante was getting at in his Divine Comedy, where you have Beatrice, beauty herself, taking him through the spheres of heaven all the way to God himself. That his soul had gone on this pilgrimage all the way from the depths of hell to God, being brought there by beauty. And that was really reflective of his entire life. Beatrice was a real woman that he had met, and seeing her just twice in his life, mind you, brought him to such deep contemplation about the divine, because this aesthetic experience was so influential upon him that he wrote one of the great epics of all of human history.
It almost reminds me also of the Taj Mahal, how this man was driven to create such beauty when confronted by the death of his wife, and thinking, this stirs my soul to create something beautiful. I think Dante also, in his ideas, are very much interwoven with Thomas Aquinas, and he posited that an object can possess beauty, but beauty exists outside of that object possessing it. And when that object possesses it, it draws us to contemplate, from whence does this attribute come?
Exactly.
And we have to think, where does this come from? In the same way that logically coherent ideas bring us to truth, well, aesthetics and order bring us to beauty, and those all exist in the same realm, and they all equally draw us to God, which is what Dante and Aquinas were trying to say.
A good example, a good illustration of this would be, it's a signpost and the destination. Mm-hmm. When we see something beautiful in the physical realm, mm-hmm. it's like seeing a sign, New York, 100 miles. Mm-hmm. And then the reality, New York City itself, mm-hmm. that would be like God himself, mm-hmm. In the transcendental metaphysical mm-hmm. realm, Mm-hmm. So everything that we're seeing is just pointing us in the right direction.
Right. And in order to achieve or arrive at that direction, we need to experience appreciation. We need to experience the aesthetic. All of the observations of the beautiful require an experience. And I think that's where the postmodern world really cripples us, because it draws us correctly and very compellingly into the world of experience, subjective experience, though. And the postmodernist says, experience is good simply because of the experience. Belief is good just because you can believe it. Beauty is good just because you can appreciate it. And it stops us from getting to the direction. It'd be like saying it's good if you're on the road as long as you're on the road. Well, I want to get somewhere.
Exactly.
I want to arrive. I want to arrive.
So is this this definition doesn't seem necessarily distinct from the previous ones.
It's complementary to it, and it presupposes them, yes, absolutely. But it's distinct in that the other ones are simply defining what beauty is. This is saying, what does beauty exist for? What's its purpose? Okay. That's why I call it the teleological definition of beauty.
I see.
I think here, too, is where Kant almost takes on the view that you were talking about, Steve, where he says there is no metaphysical. He took on a naturalist viewpoint, but he said that... I'm trying to gather my thoughts before I just start spurting things out. He said essentially that we cannot have objective morals in the world because morals are created by societies. Mm-hmm. But we need objective morals in order to have a justice system and all of that. So he said the same about beauty. He said we cannot have a subjective sense of beauty, but we need to just make it up. We need to invent it because it's necessary for life. He acknowledged that morals and absolute truth and all of that is necessary for life, but they don't actually exist, so we'll just make it up in the meantime. It was a very depressing view, and I think that's kind of what the postmodernists are taking on now. We want to have beautiful things in the world, and we want to have morals, but everybody makes up their own kind, and that's how we get subjectivism as the king.
I was familiar with Kantian ethics. I wasn't so much familiar with his aesthetic theories. And actually wasn't so much familiar that he was presupposing that his ethical theories were just made up and useful. Like, I was always under the impression he believed, them to be objective. Because I take his, ethics to be objective.
He's arguing as if they are, but Julie Miller, our very dear director of Ratio Christi, says he almost tries to overcomplicate things. I love that. This is true. But Steve, I feel like you have a lot of...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, I don't know. I'd say that something... All right, well, this might not be the same definition of objective that you guys are using. Whereas I'd say, something can be objective for humans, but that doesn't make it like this eternal concept written into the laws of the universe. It's just something that happens to work because of, we are who we are. So there could be some kind of objective morality dependent on the existence of, moral beings that, look and act like us. But it's very specific to the society that, we are capable of creating. It's not something that you can just say, this existed before we existed and is still true, even after we exist. It doesn't have the same independence that, say, mathematics does.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would have a more fluid anthropology than that. I think how you define human is very much not just up for debate, but we have the technology, or we're gathering the technology to redefine what it means to be human, so that all these things that we presuppose are like programmed into our genes or whatnot. So that kind of what you're saying is objective for humans. Well, even that might not be objective. That's something that we could presumably change about human nature eventually.
I totally agree. But I figured I might as well start here because it's the closest to agreement about the existence of objective beauty that I could get to.
Okay, so it's the common evolutionary heritage of all extant humans at the present moment.
Yeah,
Would you say that?
Yes,
Okay.
more or less. And as far as beauty is concerned, oh yeah. So what you were saying about the postmodern mindset is admittedly, it looks crazy, but I really feel like it's just a recognition that in order to understand beauty, you actually need to have some degree of education about what it is you're looking at, or at least in art. Art without any kind of context, it just doesn't work.
What do you mean by context?
It's basically like the knowledge you have, the emotions you have, like whatever you're bringing to the table when you're viewing something. I could look at a painting and feel nothing. Well, maybe not me and a painting, but I could look at some piece of art because
not possible for Steven.
at least I have a very strong attachment with painting, so it's very hard for me not to see anything in a painting.
Yeah.
But at least several years ago, this was totally possible. And I guess now, like, if I were to see something like that and realize that, like, this does nothing for me, I would feel like this is, a failing on me.
Interesting.
To some extent, that, like, I don't know anything about why or how this art was produced. So what the postmodern mindset allows for is, or at least it's the recognition that I guess the hegemony of art that we've built up over the years, that, like, we rose out of the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and, like, art just kept getting better and better, and then something happened.
Let's call it something. Let's leave it at that.
Well, what happened is realizing that art was not a progression. It was a response to what is going on, and was deeply embedded in the culture that it came from, and that the culture we're at now is, at least in the art world, I'd say, is incredibly fractured, and maybe
disillusioned.
the rest of the world. Not
Agreed.
well. There is disillusionment, but it has to do with the fact that every artist is potentially their own personal context that no one else is privy to.
Yes. I think that what you said previously, if you're looking at a painting and nothing is going on for you while you're looking at them, it's more a failure on your part than on the artist's part. And I think that is very, very insightful. I totally ascribe to that idea. And I think that almost counters the deconstructivist view that the postmodern wants us to believe, which is, if you read a book, you can read a certain amount of words and you can believe something totally different than when the reader read, because it's all about your experience as opposed to what the reader's trying to communicate. And when we focus on what the reader's trying to communicate,
The authorial intent.
Exactly.
Versus reader response.
Right. And I think that's the approach that Steven is taking to painting, which I also do as well. What is the artist trying to tell me? And of course, like you said, we bring our context to perceiving a painting. But in that sense, it's almost as though, I won't go so far to make leaps and bounds and say that's proof that beauty is subjective, but it is evidence.
I realize I left myself open to that. So I would like to say that I may have exaggerated how much of it is my fault.
I see. Okay.
And we are going to get into art very soon. In fact, in the next moment or so. I do have one bone to pick with something you said, that to have any appreciation of art whatsoever, or of beauty rather, since we're still talking about beauty, you have to have some knowledge, some context. I think there is something intrinsic, something that is instinctual that you could have. Now, context and knowledge will always increase upon that, but I think, even in infant, has some aesthetic appreciation, and there have been experiments that demonstrate this. In fact, they can distinguish between a more beautiful face than another.
You're right. Like there definitely is an aspect of instinct, and I'd say that instinct is a part of a person's context, and I don't know how universal those instincts are. Maybe some, at least for facial recognition.
Right. For facial recognition for infants, it seems to be universal regardless of race. And we're talking about, without any societal influence whatsoever. These are infants that can do nothing but actually just move their eyes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I believe that.
I think that our concept of aesthetics is very different from our concept of beauty. And here's where you were talking about how language is so important. And I think our relationship to reality and truth is very dependent on words. And so we have to define what is beauty and what is aesthetics. And I think aesthetics really is defining what is physically appealing to us for the following reasons. Symmetry, order, social consensus, attractiveness. There's also a certain amount of sexuality that goes into that because we're drawn for reproductive reasons. This is aesthetic because aesthetics equals appealing. Aesthetics equals attractive. And so that is very physical. It's very material, very base. But beauty then is something we encounter within the aesthetics. What would be an analogy? Okay, I love Tupperwares. I don't know why I like Tupperwares. But aesthetics would be like a Tupperware. Beauty goes in the Tupperware. You can't access what's in the Tupperware unless you really look at the Tupperware and open it, right? So aesthetics is the physical, and when we access that physical, we can contemplate it. Beauty requires, like Stephen was saying, an education to really appreciate it. And I don't necessarily think that is a college education, but I ascribe that it requires intelligent rationale to really access beauty. We have to ask, how can this sunset be so gorgeous? How can this painting, how can this landscape be so appealing to me? And we're thrust into this world of thinking, and it's in that world of rationale that we encounter beauty. It's in simply observing and the base, physical, the sensory that we encounter the aesthetic, which is why there can be an aesthetically appealing person who is hideous because of their character, right? And so I think that there is a difference there where, wow, this person is very attractive, but as soon as they open their mouth, they're hideous.
And I would compartmentalize. I would say, okay, well then the physical body there is, aesthetically beautiful, and the agent there, the person, is a moral monster. I just compartmentalize those things personally.
Agency is important in beauty, absolutely.
Along those lines, then, how can you be sure if that test was testing infants for their aesthetic taste, or like their intuitive aesthetic taste versus their taste for beauty?
Is there taste? Go ahead.
I guess I was operating under beauty and aesthetics as synonyms. I wasn't making the same distinction that Andrea was. Okay. And obviously the infants are only looking at the physical, and so I was really only concerning myself with the physicality there.
Okay.
The sensory experience.
Also, as far as context goes and like education, like I definitely don't mean this to be a formal education. Although, like in certain cases, that helps.
Well, all knowledge increases appreciation. I think you're saying, whether it's formal education or just having more context as to the painter's intent or the authorial intent.
Any epistemological experience.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're all in agreement there. Why don't we move on to the question, what is art? Now, there are so many potential definitions. I just wrote one that I operate under, and then I'll let you guys rip into it after I read it for our listeners. So this is the definition I came up with. Art is an artifact of human creativity in regards to either the finished product or the method of production with a semantic signifier attached. And let me break that down. When I say the finished product, I mean the piece of art, like the sculpture, the painting or whatnot, that is aesthetically pleasing in and of itself, or has a moral lesson in and of itself, or conveys some truth in and of itself, or the method of production. Jackson Pollock, good example. He had no intention of what he put on the canvas. He just had a methodology, and his intention was to operate under a methodology, and whatever resulted, so be it. That was very different from how other painters painted in the past. They had no intention, or they had a great deal of intentionality on what went on the canvas, and so the means of production was less important as it was what's actually the end product. Another example of
intention there, though. But
there absolutely is intention. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Here's an example. Flark poetry, where they'll do something like, okay, the first 5 tweets that I find today, I'm just going to gather together, and that's going to be the poem. And they have no intentionality as for the end product. It's just the methodology.
But there are boundaries. They're setting boundaries.
Oh, absolutely. And so it's still using their creativity. What they're creating is the production method, not so much the end result, but it's still something that they're creating, and it shows that creative intelligence on their part. And when I say semantic signifier attached, I just mean then the person has to call it art. They're saying this is art. I made this for artistic reasons. I'm putting it on artistic display.
That's actually, I think, if I'm understanding you, that's actually very close to my definition.
Okay.
What's yours?
Yeah.
If you have to ask, the answer is yes.
See, I would say not everything. Human creativity is really important in my definition. A sunset has so much aesthetic value, I would say, but it is not art at all.
Why
because
not?
There's no agency in creating it. It's just
There's
natural.
no agency in the sunset. What do you mean there's no agency?
It is fully explainable by natural.
There's a big agency.
I know what you're going to say.
3 letters. G-O-D. There's a lot of agency
Wait.
in the sunset.
Okay, so
what do you mean there's no
I knew this was going to come up.
Oh, me too. Me too.
And I actually have a way to reconcile it.
What?
Yes.
Okay, I'm listening.
All right. This is where mine differs from you, because I actually don't presuppose human. I don't think there actually has to be an intentionality. I think there just needs to be a perceived intentionality.
Oh, okay.
So, a sunset I would not call art, but Andrea would.
No.
Yeah, because
I see the distinction.
Because I do not perceive any intentionality behind the sunset, whereas you do. So for you, like, this is God's creation. For me, this is merely a cosmic coincidence of photons refracting off the atmosphere.
What makes it beautiful?
I like colors.
So then there, beauty is suddenly subjective again. Because if I hate colors, it's not beautiful to me, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
like
But
I'm
then-
fine with beauty being subjective.
But then whatever happened to the whole idea of the glorious, intuitive Stephen looking at the painting and saying, this isn't working for me. And you're missing something. You missed it because you didn't see it. There was something trying to be communicated. And what if we are missing something when we look at a sunset and say, it's cosmic coincidence?
Well, this is getting into our conversation from last week. Okay, sorry.
All right,
I'm sorry.
well, I might know where he's going. I don't think art has to be beautiful.
Okay.
Not where I was going, but okay.
Okay. Well,
I was just
yeah,
curious what
in
your
the
response
talk
was.
last week, like, he did mention that.
No, I mean our talk after the meeting
our
last
talk
week,
after that.
that we don't have full access to the sensory world. That our sensory experience doesn't account for the entire physical world.
Oh, that's true too. Yeah.
And so that's merely a lack of knowledge. We can't say, oh, this black, contrasted with this white is beautiful in its contrast, because it might not really be black. It might just be infrared or ultraviolet or some, part of the spectrum that we don't have access to. Or it could be true black and there could be no photons there at all.
Yeah. Additionally, like, I want to ask this question to you guys. Can we be wrong when we perceive beauty in something?
Yes.
Yes.
If I believe in objective beauty, of course I have to say yes, that it's either there or it's not, and you could falsely attribute it there because we're fallible human beings that are not perfectly logical, not perfectly reasonable, not perfectly aesthetically intuitive.
I think if we can, I draw a very close parallel with cognitive reason, belief, and truth with aesthetics, appreciation, and beauty. So if I can falsely ascribe truth to a claim, or falsely, incorrectly have an experience of cognitive reasoning, which we would call something illogical, then I would also have to say that I can falsely have an experience of beauty or falsely ascribe the appreciation, which is where I think child pornography comes into play. That is not beautiful. It is outside the boundaries of what is good. And that's why I think it draws a lot of people for the wrong reason. And I think they're trying to insert beauty in a misappropriated way.
Okay, let's get into the idea of erotic art versus pornography distinction, because the Victorians actually did what some would consider artistic portraits of nude children. Was that always necessarily pornographic? Or let's just even say the Renaissance artists, Baroque artists, when they're doing paintings of nudes, was it always necessarily pornographic just because it's depicting the human form nude? Or do we have to define pornography as the intention of creating titillation without any artistic value in itself?
That's a solid question. Roger Scruton goes into that in his book on beauty, A Short Introduction. I've read that book twice over and I still don't understand it completely. But he tries to grasp this idea of pornographic versus heavenly or otherworldly. And he mentions how in the garden, Adam and Eve were unashamed and there was complete perfection. And that, I think, was beautiful. So what a lot of the Renaissance, maybe late Middle Ages, what they were trying to do in their art was show this is God's creation, this is Imago Dei, and trying to show this is the implant of the image of God, the soul in the person. So if we look at, is it Titian's Venus or Aphrodite? The one, it's a nude, she's on a seashell.
The Birth of Aphrodite?
That one.
That's
yes.
Botticelli.
Botticelli.
Yes,
thank
yes.
you. Much more educated than me. Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. If we look at that and contrast it with even a catalog from Kmart or something where the women are much more clothed, I think we see a contrast, and we contemplate her existence in Botticelli's painting. We're observing, and we're not trying to possess her. We're simply observing the beauty and the value that she's exhibiting, as opposed to a Kmart catalog where we're trying to possess what she has. There's almost an allurement and an envy trying to be drawn out. And I think that's a distinction of the beauty and the erotic, where the erotic is trying to manipulate desire and beauty is trying to use contemplation as a reflection towards a greater good. The ultimate is not the flesh, the ultimate is something far deeper.
I believe it was Chief Justice Anthony Scalia in what I think was the 2001 court case, Ashcroft v. Free Speech Coalition, where he said famously, "I don't know what the definition of pornography is, but I know it when I see it." And I have recently offered my own definition of pornography. It's kind of a contrast to the teleological definition of beauty. It's the misappropriation of that which has aesthetic value for an end that is contrary to the beatific vision. It's drawing you away from that using the same elements. It's the same, or the opposite side of the same coin, essentially.
Right. So if we can rule that there's certain pornographic images that are perceived to be beautiful, we can take something really easy like child pornography, where almost everyone can say that is wrong, you cannot exploit children. If we can say that's perceived to be beautiful, therefore it must be, say no, perception alone is not a sufficient factor to create an arena for beauty, then we can say, well, then there must be an objective standard of beauty if there can be a misappropriated perception of it. Meaning subjective experience alone is not enough to define beauty. There has to be something objective.
Because beauty is not the only end in and of itself. You also have goodness, and if something is morally monstrous, that might outweigh beauty as the end there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you can determine it, though.
And that's what Chief Justice Scalia was saying. Or not chief, just justice. It was Chief Justice Roberts at the time.
And I think that goes into Edmund Burke spoke about. He wrote a book in I don't know what year. Bad at numbers. That's why I went into journalism. But he wrote a book. I think it's called On Beauty and the Sublime. And he spoke about fear and terror, where he intertwines the monstrous, the morally evil that can be inserted into the aesthetic, and how aesthetics is almost like a gateway for both morally evil and beauty and morally good to enter, which is why we see most fairy tales. There's the wicked witch who's terrifyingly beautiful. So beauty alone, I don't think brings us to moral goodness, but it is interchangeable with evil and good. And he says that fear and awe work in that way. I'm afraid of this terrifying beauty, and I'm in awe of this stunning beauty.
That kind of answers the questions that were next on our list. Ought art be beautiful, and what constitutes good art? And I do think good art should have some element of either truth, goodness, or beauty. And there is some overlap there, and there are some contrary principles at work there too, as we've noted. Famously, Keats said in what I think is one of the greatest poems of the English language, Ode on a Grecian Urn, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." And there is this overlap of truth and beauty.
As Steve is drawing away, creating some beautiful artwork on the table right now.
Let's move on to the next question. What is the relationship between the artist and art? And specifically in regards to, the morality of the artist, or the intentionality of the artist and the art that they're producing.
I actually had one thing to say about the
please.
The what constitutes good art.
Yeah.
So going back to when I said the failing is on me if I don't get the reaction, that can only go so far. Now, supposing I do have the proper context to understand, to understand where the artist was coming from. I guess this ties in a bit into their intention and what this was created for. Then, if I don't get any feeling from there, that or at least I'm more capable of judging, whether or not this has been successful in getting across the artist's intention. Now, what can happen sometimes is that the artist will make something without a particular intention, some vague intention, but I can perceive, something else in it, and I don't think that the artwork is unsuccessful just because the artist didn't intend for me to find a certain something in it. Perhaps my aesthetic ability is more refined in some way, or at least refined in a very particular way, that I have the context to see something in it that the artist did not intend.
If someone were to look at the Mona Lisa and say, "Wow, what a beautiful giraffe," we would say, "Well, that's nice you just experienced beauty," but we would have to say that their perception was incorrect, right?
I agree.
Yeah, the artist, I think, does retain some message. He is trying to communicate something in his art. Otherwise, he wouldn't take the effort to put the brushstroke on there. There's some agency behind painting and sculpting and all that.
In literary criticism, I absolutely reject reader response and absolutely hold to authorial intent.
Okay. Now, suppose there was a giraffe in the Mona Lisa that no one else noticed.
But there is no.
No. But there
Okay.
isn't. And we know enough to know that there isn't.
Okay.
But say if you were to follow, the line of her hair through a path into the background that that this thing is hidden. That just because of the way the brushstrokes went.
So not even on the intention of Da Vinci himself.
Yes. That there's actually a really nice depiction of a giraffe hidden within the brushstrokes that...
And according to my definition, I'd say that giraffe could potentially be beautiful, but it can't be art.
Aha! That makes sense.
So...
that...
Whereas you would...
I think I would I could still conceive it as art, but I think because I'm okay moving the intentionality to the viewer.
Right. I see where you're coming from there. Okay. But back to this idea of the relationship between the artist and art. Can you have good art from a moral monster, someone that is utterly terrible? Or can you have good art from an utter idiot that had, very little intentionality? The example I was thinking of when we were talking last week was, imagine, monkeys blindingly, throwing feces at a typewriter, produce the entire works of Shakespeare. What is the artistic value of that versus the aesthetic value?
Right.
Now, my presupposition, according to my definition, it has the exact same aesthetic value as the works of Shakespeare, but it has no artistic value because there's no intentionality.
There's no agency.
Right.
Absolutely.
And we were debating more so during our talk last week, morality.
Right.
What if this complete moral monster, this hypocrite, is painting great works of religious significance commissioned by the church?
Like
Caravaggio, our favorite artist.
I don't want to name names.
Well, I think that's the beauty of redemption, and I think that is where we see the cross being made real in our lives, where we see we're all ultimately moral monsters. Perhaps we wouldn't all be Hitlers or Stalins, but at our core, we all have dark secrets, right? We all have things that we know are wicked at the core. We don't expose them all, but they're there. And we're still capable of creating immense beauty and of creating works of art that stir the soul towards something much higher than our own selves. And in that sense, I think a moral monster can create beauty because God created us. Even though we're fallen, we can continue to create beauty because we're like Him.
Although, against your point, Hitler was not a very good artist either.
Oh, he was terrible. He was terrible. No, he had some nice watercolors.
That was a joke.
Some of his earlier works are actually not that bad.
I was a bit serious.
Okay, because I've seen some of his paintings. Because they always bring it up. It was like, if only he hadn't got kicked out of art school. They're art student works, and I think part of the issue is that they're also very classical. Which
was not in vogue at the time. It was
40s,
against the Zeitgeist.
Or the 20s or whenever it was he was in art school.
Yeah.
But some of them, I think, were beautiful, and that is very compelling that someone who's perceived to be so wicked could create something bordering on beauty. And I think that really is the message of the gospel, that regardless of how broken we are, we can be redeemed, and we can create beauty and be part of the sphere of goodness, truth, and beauty where God is.
Now, the doctrine that I brought up last week was not so much redemption as ex opere operato, which is Latin for by the work performed. And this deals with the Catholic and Orthodox and Lutheran understanding of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, saying that even if you have an apostate or a hypocrite or an unbeliever that's, as the priest or the pastor, consecrating the host, it is no less a valid sacrament. It is every bit as much fully Christ there. It's the true presence. Nevertheless, even if this person is not a godly man doing it. And so I would say that you can, by analogy, have someone that is not a moral man, not a godly man, not a smart man, creating a work of beauty. Maybe not so much art with intentionality, but definitely a work of beauty by their hand.
In the same way that someone who can believe that they're telling a lie, but the message they're telling is a truth.
Exactly.
It's not subjective to the person or the experience of the message being transmitted, but rather to the objective value that is being possessed in the words or in the work of art.
Exactly. Let's talk about the relationship between process and product. We touched upon that a little bit earlier, talking about the process.
I think of spam when you say that. Process and product. Not beautiful.
I can see that.
That's my subjective experience, right?
Yeah.
What do you guys think? Do we concern ourselves with the process of how something is made? The example that the artist brought up at our meeting was the urine that was used to illuminate this cross to create what some would call a beautiful picture of a crucifix, but the additional knowledge that you have that he used things like urine to create it. Some people are outraged by that. They take issue with it. Does the process matter?
I can't say anything definitive, honestly.
I do have a definitive side on this myself.
I think sometimes it matters more than others. In Jackson Pollock's work, I think the process is kind of the major point. Like the fact that like this was done on the floor by kind of a wild man shaking like paint any way that his intuition told him, like that knowledge of that process along with the product is kind of what made this such a revolutionary way of working.
Whereas I'm entirely on the opposite side on this.
Really?
I believe only the product itself matters. I go back to commercial art a lot. Comic books I'm very much a fan of. I just spent so much money on comic books this morning. Besides the point, one of the more controversial artists I mentioned in our main last week, Greg Land, he uses things like Photoshop and tracing and photo referencing, and he'll look at pictures of models and he'll just kind of like draw over their faces to make the comic book women look like that.
Right.
And he has some of the best looking art in comics, but he's absolutely hated because people know the process and they think he's taking shortcuts, he's cheating, he's not really a good artist, he's not skilled, even if the images on the comic book page are very,
But
beautiful.
See, I see what you're saying, but here I have to, Steve, this doesn't happen very often, but I have to agree with Steve. The process is what shows there was agency. The process is what shows there was intentionality, and intentionality is what makes it art, as opposed to an accident that someone perceives to be beautiful. It has to have rationale behind it and a process for it to be art.
Okay, well, we are pressed for time, so we'll have to disagree on that one and keep moving on because we are almost out of time. So, or else we would be debating this one.
Yeah.
Kind of like the last question, what's the value of commercial art? I just kind of brought it up, my appreciation of commercial art. Should it be held to the same standards as fine art?
I don't even know what those standards are.
I don't think so. In the same way that we compared Kmart with The Birth of Venus, the Kmart catalog, commercial art is meant to allure and draw, and I think it almost manipulates our desire for beauty to the end of consumption, where the end of beauty, the ultimate end, should be a contemplation of the metaphysical, of the values that God possesses. So it's beautiful, but I don't think on the same plane as fine art.
And I think that's how the world operates. I think that's most people's conception, especially like all these people with MBAs that are running these major corporations that produce, all these works of commercial art. And I lament the fact. I wish they had a greater appreciation of art as an end in itself and saw themselves as patrons of the arts, not so much concerned with, satisfying their investors as they are in satisfying, the human longing for beauty or truth in the world. That's not the case, though, and it saddens me every day.
Yep.
I'd say, I don't know, like being held to the same standards. As I said, like I'm not totally sure what you mean by that. Like if we put it all on the same plane and judge it, on one end, like the fine art, is great, and maybe the commercial art is great, but only if judged as commercial art. I'm like, well, why don't we just put it all on the same level and judge it for what it is? Like if someone makes some kind of commercial art that has the same degree of harmony and balance as something that someone intended to put in a museum, why not appreciate that?
That's the philosophy I live by. Yeah, absolutely. Any final thoughts before we go? I have so much more I want to say.
Me too, but
I think we're going to have to do a follow-up episode. And in fact, I talked to Julie through Facebook today. I suggested as a follow-up to our discussion on aesthetics, a discussion on pornography as kind of the reverse. So hopefully we'll get to revisit this topic in the future.
Sounds good.
Okay, that has been Ratio in Review for the week of October 6th, 2014. Thank you for listening.